and it's certainly a pleasure for me to be here. I'm here in part because keeping a distance is not in my nature, particularly in a situation such as this. We learned 12 years ago that it is possible, even under modern conditions, nobody doubted it was possible in the past, but even under modern conditions, to confect a war from false evidence. Admittedly, that evidence concerned the presence or absence of alleged weapon systems in a distant country to which very few Americans had immediate access, and a country which had a government of unquestioned brutality. What we are learning today is that it is possible to confect a narrative of economic crisis that bears even less relationship, if possible, to the realities, and to do so in a country with which, or with respect to a country with which millions of people from its immediate neighborhood and around the world are intimately familiar. If we go back very briefly to the immediate origins of the present debacle, it obviously had its roots in the global financial crisis, which did not begin here, but that emerged initially from the banking system, the financial system of the United States, which had undergone 2 decades of deregulation, de-supervision, what my friend Bill Black calls de facto decriminalization, that led to the most massive wave of financial fraud in human history, in the American housing markets in particular, alongside parallel phenomena in Europe that were largely in the private sector in Ireland and Spain, also concerning the public sector here in Greece. It was a body of financial activity in which the banks of Europe were deeply, unmistakably complicit, knowingly complicit in many instances. And if there were, let's say, naive victims in the investor community, they were quite far down the chain. People who bought worthless assets on representations that they should not have accepted in the first place. Any amount of due diligence would have told them they should not have accepted. In the collapse, investment community did what investment communities do under these circumstances. It fled to safety. It moved its assets massively out of the private sector into the public sector of the richest and most stable countries, including the United States Treasury, Germany, Britain, France, and so forth, and out of the sovereign bonds of every other country, causing this enormous difference in yields and collapse of values. This body of fact, which was certainly wholly familiar to the world in 2008 and 2009, somehow became transformed into an entirely different narrative of state failure, and especially so here in Greece. State failure which had undoubtedly many roots in known facts and in the consciousness of Greek people have about the inadequacy of their state system and their political classes, but nevertheless a narrative which wholly excluded the weight and force of the overwhelming body of facts behind the crisis. The purpose of this shift in narrative was to facilitate a massive rescue of the banks who were exposed to sovereign debts at the time, and in particular French and German banks, but especially the French banks. That was the essence of the program that was implemented in 2010. And consider the details. I was here very taken by the testimony a few days ago of Philippe Legrand, former advisor to Barroso, president of the European Commission, before the Parliamentary Commission of the Greek Parliament investigating the debt. Legrand laid out a number of the details. Why, for example, was the International Monetary Fund engaged in this to the extent of 32 times Greece's quota, the largest single loan in its history? Well, the answer to that, it appears, was at least in part because the managing director at the time, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, wished to become president of France. And why did the European Central Bank embark on the so-called securities market program, the SMP program, buying up Greek bonds that would otherwise have been haircut and were, the other ones that were not bought up were haircut in 2012. And the answer to that was because Jean-Claude Trichet, the head of the European Central Bank, wished to support the price of those bonds for the benefit, amongst others, of the French banks who were trying to sell them. Why did Angela Merkel want the International Monetary Fund in this? For the political support that it brought to the whole package. Why were the internal objections of the IMF staff and of certain executive directors, which are detailed in memoranda from the IMF at the time, why were these overruled? The answer was given to them at the time, is that this was a political program. And there is no question, as you've just heard, that this financial rescue operation was then, if you like, capitalized into a most effective and devastating campaign on the institutions of social welfare in Europe, and particularly in Greece, into the effective destruction of the pension system, of labor market institutions, and of the state-held assets, all done on a basis of, let's say, duress and forced action, which, from any economic point of view, had just multiple malignancies associated with it. It is important, I think, not to underestimate the intentions and the power of one's adversary in a situation like this, but it's also important not to overestimate it. And I think it is important to recognize the significance of the events that occurred here in Greece over the course of the last few years, particularly since 2012, as the Greek people came to appreciate the true nature of the policies to which they were subjected, the true nature of the economic collapse which was being imposed on them and which was being tolerated without even recognition that it was going on. This was a population that did not drift off into the hands of a readily available extreme right, in fact, Nazi party, but rather consolidated itself around a political movement that was profoundly democratic, profoundly actually pro-European, at least in principle, and that offered a clear and coherent critique of the entire structure of European policy. And that was, of course, Syriza. And the rise of Syriza as a political phenomenon is, I think, something which is of great importance and quite easy to underestimate, as the so-called European partners have, in fact, underestimated it. It is true that when Syriza came to power in the elections of January 25th, that it did so on a premise of hope that there could be a significant and effective negotiation that would lead to an improvement of conditions through a change in policies in Europe. It is not true that the new government was unaware at the time of the risks associated with this course of action. It was acutely aware of the larger, let's say, political and intellectual climate in the north of Europe, that is to say, the reality-free bubble in which the North European elites were operating and in which the media has been operating with respect to the conditions, particularly in Greece, was acutely aware of the hostility toward this development, this political development. Was it counting on a good scenario? I don't think it was at all. I was there in Brussels in the middle of February in the negotiations that led up to the discussions that led up to the so-called February 20th agreement. And I don't think that there was any illusion about the risks associated with that agreement. But there was also an awareness that a new government, one which is formed out of political forces that have only come together recently, and which are known to be, like all left forces, fractious and easily disunited, and that was formed in coalition with a right-wing populist party as well. It had to be established that that coalition was solid, and it had to be established that its policy line would hold under pressure. And to establish that requires time. And time had to be bought or borrowed in order to achieve this purpose. So the February 20th agreement bought 4 months of negotiating time with the understanding on the part of the negotiators on the Greek side that when you got to the end of June, when you got to where we are now, it might well be the case that the country would be broke and that the political support for the government would have evaporated. That was a risk that was very clearly understood in February and deeply considered. But it was a risk that had to be taken. As it turns out, we are now at the end of June. The country is broke. The reserves have been depleted, and you know the conditions in the hospitals and so forth. But the political will of the country does not appear to have been broken. So I would argue that at least in one important respect, the government's judgment in February was justified. That is to say, it has been able to demonstrate to anybody who's remotely a close observer that it has a solid coalition and it continues to have a very substantial base of internal support. But what has followed during that 4-month period to get to this point? Just a number of things, all of which you are fully familiar with. The first is a campaign of vilification in the European press, also in the Greek press, accompanied by the most remarkable cavalcade, avalanche of self-righteous, hypocritical, and reality-free commentaries, of which I suppose one of the most classic examples was Chancellor Merkel the other day, saying that the Greeks are remarkably ungrateful for the unprecedented levels of support and assistance that they've received from their European partners. It's like, what? Unprecedented? The word unprecedented caught the attention of a friend of mine who sent me an email with it underlined 5 or 6 times, noting that if you go back just a little ways in history to, say, 1953, one would find some precedents in which Germany was treated with considerably more magnanimity than Greece is being treated today. It seems to have been forgotten. But I don't fault, actually, Chancellor Merkel. I strongly suspect that she is, as any politician would, responding both to her domestic political requirements and to the information set with which she has been supplied by those who surround her, both at the European level and in her own government. And that information set simply does not contain a, let's say, reality-based assessment of the conditions in Greece. I have sat in the office of the finance minister of Germany, Wolfgang Schäuble, and I've listened to comments made by his aides in the course of an hour-and-a-half meeting. And it's very clear that their view of the matter is casual and basically something that is retail, that they get at retail level from the German press and other sources. Second thing we've seen is a pseudo-negotiation in which, first of all, there was a great deal of discussion over the terms under which it was conducted and who could conduct it, with the Europeans insisting on people that they thought would be more malleable. It's quite amusing because, in fact, they didn't know who they were dealing with at all. But basically, the structure of the negotiations was comparable to let's say, the relationship between a distinguished dissertation supervisor and a particularly bad student who continually turns in inadequate drafts and is continually told to go back and rewrite them. The professor is never asked to present a draft of his own. In this situation, it's just, okay, you've got your last version, now will you in 2 days send us a new one? And the new one always has to have more concessions than the one before. This process quickly became quite fatiguing to the Greek side, and I must say, I said to the team members that nobody in their right mind would envy them their assignment. What is the point of convergence here? The point of convergence, of course, is to the previous memorandum of 2012, the one-size-fits-all solution to all European economic problems. And there was a discussion of Leninism a few minutes ago. I wrote a piece a week or so ago in which I coined the phrase market Stalinism to describe this particular phenomenon, because of the complete obliviousness to, let's say, the differences in economic conditions or outcomes from the policy. Basically one policy for an entire continent, for an entire world. The third aspect that we've seen is the emergence of, at least is evident disarray on the creditor's side. Differences in particular between the International Monetary Fund, which correctly basically agrees with the Greek government position that the debt must be restructured, and those on the European side for whom the writing down of face value is anathema for reasons related, I suppose, to the self-esteem of the European financial system. Fourth, going through this entire process, a policy of economic asphyxiation, which has basically prevented any improvement in underlying conditions. This is a policy administered by the European Central Bank and through the Greek banking system. This drip by drip, step by step, week by week increase in the emergency liquidity assistance, which sends a signal always to the depositors in the Greek banking system that they would be well advised to keep a close eye on matters and to pull out a little bit more money every few days in order to assure themselves against the possibility that the emergency liquidity assistance will not be extended in the days immediately ahead. And that process has been going on. It leaves the banking system absolutely unable to function in any ordinary way, even if it were inclined to do so under these conditions, which it clearly is not. And finally, as the process gets close to the deadline, the government already having bundled its payments to the IMF into the last day of June, we get the presentation clearly of ultimata, which will intensify as time runs out. In fact, are intensifying as we speak. One thing that has happened, though, over the course of the 4 months, and I think is clear over this weekend, is that the other side has come very reluctantly to the realization that, in fact, the government of Greece is not bluffing, is not playing games. Something that they could have discovered had they read and chosen to believe what Yanis Varoufakis was saying very clearly months ago. I was with him, by the way, a few days ago in Heraklion at quite a wonderful political event, filling the main square of the city, just 4 of us up on the table in front of a very large crowd of people, an event that went on for, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, late into the night. And he said one thing that a friend of mine who was in the audience translated for me afterwards, that he said, you know, we're not bluffing, and we're not even meta-bluffing. The government's position is what it is. They have stated what their red lines are. Those red lines have to do with pensions, they have to do with labor markets, they have to labor rights, they have to do with privatizations. They have to do with achieving a remotely achievable macroeconomic projection that is something that will not force the economy further into contraction. These are not ambitious or radical goals. They are, in every respect, what any common sense economist would recommend. They are opposed to the reduction of a large section of the Greek population to complete destitution, not just the elderly, but the families that depend upon them. They are opposed to the, what I would call and have called the unethical experiment of labor market deregulation on the completely pragmatic ground that that deregulation forces people into the informal market and destroys the fiscal basis of the state, as well as on the principled and political ground that workers have a right to collective bargaining as recognized by international standards. It should not be derogated by Europe. And they're opposed to forced draft privatizations because, in part, they are ill-considered. They create private monopolies in many cases which are purely predatory in character and don't improve anything having to do with economic function, and because they don't bring in money. When you put everything on the auction block at once, as any economist will tell you, the price goes down. And the record of the privatization program so far establishes that. One might wish for more, let's say, emphatic and, let's say, politically forceful positions, but these positions can be defended to anybody. They can be defended basically to anybody who has an open mind, whatever their political persuasion. And that's where the government is standing, that's where it is going to stand. And as the other side realizes this, what are we getting? We're getting a very interesting and very ugly 2-word phrase, which has its, let's say, resonance with the experience of 12 years ago. And that phrase, which was used in a tweet by one of the most influential and powerful figures in the establishment press, Anatol Kolesky, just a few days ago, yesterday, is regime change. Regime change with respect to a newly elected, fully democratic government of a European state. Not with respect to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, not even with respect to the government in Tehran, but with respect to a member state of the European Union. Regime change. Ну, что делать? Как сказал мой друг Kagarlitsky. What is to be done? I have a piece coming out in Deutsche Welle on Monday, in which I sketch out a point of principle, or a point of, let's say, pragmatic idealism. It's probably the last time I'm going to be able to do that, so I thought I'd take advantage of the opportunity. And it's based upon a metaphor, an idea that occurred to me actually sitting in Wolfgang Schäuble's office and listening to him say basically that he had no further ideas, that he did not see how the matter could be resolved. And the idea is this, that if Europe were a hospital, it would be a hospital that lacks an intensive care unit. It would be a hospital where the doctors come in, they check out the patients. They find one patient whose condition is markedly worse than all of the others, who suffered a 28% loss of income, as opposed to, let's say, 8%, as we heard with respect to Italy, is suffering a 30% unemployment rate, is suffering a massive hemorrhage. Medical metaphors can be extended indefinitely, of talented people leaving for overseas, so forth, so on and so forth. And what do? They gather around the bedside and they lecture the patient. She must exercise. She must take more of the medicines which have already poisoned her. She must not complain. She must, above all, not seek any further treatment. In any normal modern hospital, that patient would be on life support. She would be in a special unit designed for patients who have particularly weak constitutions and have reacted particularly badly to the course of treatment that they've been exposed to. She would have an oxygen mask, feeding tube, saline solution. She would have all the care designed, transfusions and so forth, all the care designed to restore and stabilize the system before anything else was done. That's what an intensive care unit is. A hospital without an intensive care unit has a direct line from the ordinary ward to the morgue. And the patient in this situation is to consider. Oh, and I add the doctors go back to their offices and they squabble amongst themselves over whether they should have surgery, debt restructuring, or not surgery. They object to that because the operations are costly. And by the way, if you gave this patient an operation and cut off her debt, then think what the other patients might ask for and how costly that would be. And so Europe has become like a hospital in which the Hippocratic oath, the Greek oath, first do no harm, has been replaced by the principle first lose no money. And in that situation, the patient has to decide whether or not to get up and leave, which is always a decision that requires a certain amount of courage. Has anybody ever been in a hospital and contemplated leaving against medical advice? Was no. You go home, you may die. On the other hand, you go home, you may improve. If the medical regime is in fact poisoning you, anything can happen when you go home. And think how the doctors will feel, how furious they will be if you go home and things start getting better. The actual reality, I think it will become clear, has already become clear, but let's say will be proved, perhaps in the next few days, is that there is no point of convergence that is possible for this squabbling committee of doctors and this extremely sick, but rather brave patient. And then we shall see what will happen. Maybe the doctors will simply throw her out of the hospital. In which case, there is no question that the immediate passage will be quite rough. The legal issues are extraordinarily tangled. The administrative challenges are very significant. If you pass through those, however, who knows what the situation will be afterwards. I think most fundamentally, the question facing this country and all of her friends is whether the political and social situation will hold together through the months ahead. That is a test which cannot perhaps be avoided. And if it has to be faced, and if it is faced successfully, it is one which will resonate all across the world, and certainly all across Europe in the months ahead. And so I would suggest, in the question of what should be done, that thinking about that, thinking about one's own sort of ethical obligations in a very difficult moment is a very high priority. It's a very high priority because it's not just, well, the fate of the country certainly depends on it, but also the capacity to hope for, let's say, an object lesson that can demonstrate that a better course of action is possible. That capacity to hope also rests on what happens here over the next few months. Thanks very much.